So what we're going to do here is explain a little bit about how to interpret headphone measurements. It is not easy. So we're going to go through a whole kind of series of slides here so that you can understand sort of what neutral is. So what we're looking for in this adventure we're about to go on is neutral. We're going to assume that flat exists, and then we're going to try to find out what that is on headphones. Now, I'm not saying that flat is best. I'm just saying that flat is a real thing on speakers, and right now we don't know what that is on headphones. And what the industry is trying to do is figure out where flat is on headphones. So first of all, flat on a speaker is considered when it has equal response to all frequencies in an anechoic chamber, okay? So flat on a speaker is not measured in a room, it's measured in an anechoic chamber. So we put a measurement microphone in front of a speaker, and if the speaker is flat, we run the right tone through it, we get a flat line on the end. And then we move the measurement microphone out of the way, and we put a person there. And when you're listening, you listen to the sound that's hitting your eardrum. And so when you listen to, when you put a human in front of a speaker like that, you want to know what's at the eardrum, because what's at the eardrum is what you want when you put on a pair of headphones, okay? So what we're first going to look at is what flat from a flat speaker looks like at your eardrum, okay? So what happens is you get a lot of bouncing of sound from the body that creates changes to the tonality because you have boundary gain. And we're going to take a look at this next picture here. This is the frequency response at an eardrum for flat external sound. This black line right there. And that black line is the sum of all these other lines underneath. And each of those lines underneath is the change in equalization that occurs when your body is put in front of a pair of speakers and you're looking at the eardrum response. So number one is this general bump right here. And that is just boundary gain from your head. So you can imagine, everybody here know what boundary gain is? Anybody not know what boundary gain is? The best kind of explanation for it that I've heard is you take a pier, a pole that's sitting in the water, right? A pier from a dock. And you have very long, low frequency waves coming by that pier. Well, that pier is going to do nothing to those waves. Big, long waves that just the water is going to go up and down around the pier. But as the wavelength gets shorter and shorter and shorter, about the time that the wavelength, the half wavelength is the same diameter as the pier, you're going to start to get reflections, and you'll get waves that reflect off that pier once the waves get short enough. And as they get even shorter, you'll see behind the pier a shadow of those waves that wasn't there with low frequencies, okay? Well, as soon as that pier starts bouncing energy back, the gain at the surface of that frequency is increased, okay? So in order to get it to reflect, it actually increases the gain right at the boundary. So this line right here, the number one line, is the gain from the head. The number two line is the gain from the torso. So you have a similar thing that happens with your body right here. It's a little bit different in that your ear isn't located on that surface, but it does reflect and you get an increase in gain. And it has a funny little feature here in that it dips below, and that's a cancellation that occurs due to the fact that the head is one blob and the body is a different blob, and at a certain frequency they're going to interfere with each other. All right, so then, so those are two of the effectors. The next three effectors happen in the ear, and we'll just go to the next picture. This number 3 line is gain from the concha bowl right here. So this is this cup in the ear. Acts like a little focusing antenna, and it focuses sound into the ear to get some gain. The red one, the number 5 one, is resonances of the ear canal. The ear canal is going to have resonances at 2.7, and then every third harmonic above that, so 2.7 and then 7 point something and 15, or I can't remember them all. And then lastly, number 4 here is reflection from this outer ridge around the ear. In the end, what you have is this curve. When you add all those curves up together, it has a big gain right at about 3K. Okay, that is the eardrum response. Now, if you listen to a pair of headphones, the idea that we're going to drive at here is that when you listen to a pair of headphones, it should sound like a pair of speakers in a good room. Because you're replaying music. Music is designed to be played on speakers, and then this is what and so headphones should mimic that. Even that is not universally believed as a truth.
This is assuming a plane wave source in front of the head, right?
We're getting right there. You're right at the right moment for that question, exactly.
Not a plane wave source here, but one actually.
This particular diagram is for 45 degrees off axis. Okay, so that, yeah, this particular diagram. So, the next thing we're going to take a look at is exactly what he said. The sound of the sound is going to change depending on the angle that it's coming towards you. So when you with headphones, if you're trying to mimic speakers, you should be looking at the sound 30 degrees off axis. So when we build one of those curves like this, what we have to do is build one for sound coming 30 degrees off axis in a good room from a pair of speakers. That's the compensation curve that we should probably use. And that compensation curve does not exist today. Well, we're getting close. Sean Olive at Harman is getting close to, is that Sean Olive at Harman right there? There's Sean. He's getting close to this, but he's worked at it from a very sort of complicated perspective. But let me go back to where I'm at here. So this standard of sound coming from 30 degrees to either side in a room does not exist. So what has existed in the past as an acoustic standard is the free field response, and the free field response is the eardrum response to sound in an anechoic chamber that is coming from directly in front of you. Okay, so this is not what speakers sound like. The other diffuse field response is the other one that has been used for a long, long time, and the diffuse field response is in a very live room. Think of a concrete room or a bathroom, a concrete room with speakers in all 8 corners playing pink noise at the same time, and what that sounds like at the eardrum. So that's the free field response, or sorry, diffuse field response. Well, that's not speakers in a room either. And these are what those curves look like. They're upside down from that first curve we looked at, but these are what those curves look like, the diffuse field and the free field. And there's another one in there, independent of direction, that it's not really a standard. Okay, so what makes sense for headphones is speakers in a room, I believe. I've believed that for a long, long time, and I was so happy to hear that Sean Olive believed that as well, and has started doing work at Harman, and came out with the target response curve. So that's the black curve right there. Now, the thing that's important to know is we're trying to mimic speakers in a room. And with speakers in a room, they are not flat anymore. Okay, they are now in a room, and they're going to get boundary gain from the walls. They're also going to get a bass boost, essentially due to the narrowing of the sound energy coming from speakers as frequency increases, so that the sound power in a room there's more energy at low frequencies than there is at high frequencies, because the speakers beaming at higher and higher frequencies don't pump up the room like the low frequencies do. And so this target response curve has a low frequency boost in it. And the green curve is a eardrum response in an anechoic chamber. Isn't that not in a room?
No, it's the in-room response of the background neutral speaker with the eardrum.
So how come it doesn't have a bass boost?
Well, that's before we flattened it and equalized it.
Oh, that's right. You intentionally flattened it. Right. Okay. So that the green dotted line is an in-room response of a good pair of speakers that have been equalized to flat. So they're equalized to flat. And essentially what they found out was that people like a little bit less high energy, high frequency energy than what's flat in a room, and they want more bass than what's flat, because they want to hear essentially the room. The people are used to hearing speakers in rooms. All right, so I'm going to skip through a couple things here right quick. So this is this is what one of the charts looks like, and this is where the frequency response is on one of the charts. And this is really an important graphic right here. I'm going to dwell on this for a minute, because you're just going to have to kind of remember this when you look at charts and stuff like that. So this 4 dB roughly bass boost, the zero line we're going to call the lowest point in the mid-range. Okay, and the bass boost should be about 4 dB above that. Should start tapering off at 60 hertz and go up to about 200 hertz at most. So the bass boost should start at 200 hertz or below and go up about 4 dB and be up there by 60 hertz. Then from 200 hertz and above, it's very important that it starts slowly to go increase in level at about 1 kilohertz right here. It increases faster and rises to about 13 to 15 dB above the zero line at about 3K. And then it starts rolling off. You're at 10K, you're back down to the baseline, and above 10K it falls off fairly steeply. Okay, this is what gets loosely called the Harman target response curve, and I will say that, and you'll have to correct me if this is true, but this is not an official curve yet, right? You're still sort of in the middle of research still. Yeah, this is not a finalized thing. This was an illustration of where your thinking was at that time. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. So, measuring headphones, we do it with items like this. This is the measurement head that I use right here. It's a Head Acoustics. There's a number of different ones like that. And that's what takes these measurements. All right, now we're going to just go through some headphones here, and we're going to take a quick look at them. Some historically good sounding headphones. This is the Sennheiser HD580. Traditional old school can. You can see it rolls off below the primary resonance of the driver, which is somewhere in here. The old headphones of this age didn't really have very good bass response. Doesn't have this rising through the upper mid-range right here. It's flat, stays flat to 1K, rises up, does have the peak at 3K. It is about 10 dB, 11 dB up right there. Does fall off, and now you're going to start seeing a bunch of squiggles and wiggly stuff up here. Now, what we're really looking for is at 10K that you're around the zero line again, which is about right here, but it's a bit low. And what you have to do is kind of mentally average all this stuff in here. These are all like resonances that occur in the cup and of the headphone, and it will wiggle around a lot in this area. Some headphones will do better than others on paper, but I'm not sure how much that really translates into what's right, okay? It's probably right that there's some up and down stuff going on in there because there are resonances that we're dealing with. There are resonances in the ear canal that should show up on measurements, and it's okay that they do because that's normal the way we hear.
Are you purposely moving the headphones here? Or are you just taking them off and trying to put them back in the same spot?
No, the bottom measurements I do, these are 5 measurements where I move the headphones slightly forward, slightly back, slightly up, slightly down, and centered over the ear. And I do that so that all these wiggles move around a little bit, so that when it's averaged together in this top line and compensated, it isn't quite as noisy, and it may show more of what's really there as opposed to just all these, well, the resonances are really there, but. So the fact that this headphone is a little low after 10 at 10K, you see we're kind of below the target curve. See, the target curve should bulge out a little bit, and then when it crosses there. So this one doesn't do that. Well, that's what I think that is the famous Sennheiser veil. Everybody said the 580, 600, and 650 had this veiled sound, and that's probably where you can see it on the measurement.
Does this not apply to in-ear monitors?
This does apply to in-ear monitors because the eardrum should always have that response. You should have that response at the eardrums. They get it a little bit differently, and I'll show some in-ear monitors here shortly. Okay, this is the AKG K701. It's a similar vintage headphone at the same time. You can see it's a little more positionally sensitive on the bottom here as it moves up and down, so it didn't quite seal as reliably as the 580 in the last slide. Now it's perfectly flat all the way through here above 10K, and then it goes up, not really high enough, but it does go up there, but then it stays up. So this one has the opposite problem of the 580 of the last slide, in that it has excess energy up here in this region. And with the 701, you can hear that it's a bit of a bright headphone. This is a biodynamic DT880. It's this very similar vintage. All 3 of these headphones at one time were considered the top of the heap. Again, flat through this area when it should be slowly rising. It's got a 10 dB going up, which is fine. And then it doesn't go down at all, hardly. It just pretty much stays up there to 10K before it drops off. This should be a little bit brighter sounding headphone than the 701, and it indeed is a little bit brighter. All those 3 were open. This is a Denon HD580. This is semi-closed headphone, and being semi-closed in that era allowed them to actually get a little bit more extension in the bass. And when this headphone came out, everybody was really happy about the bass and thought that it was sick and loved it, which was fine. And it has a nice rise up here. The problem is that this bass does bleed up. This rise remains high up into the middle of the mid-range, and so this headphone should sound a little thick because the bass boost should be down back to the bass line by 200 hertz, and it's not, and which gives it kind of a low mid-range bloominess to it. It makes it a little thick sounding. And then again, this headphone doesn't roll off enough after the peak, so this headphone can sound a little bright as well. So this headphone has a smiley face signature where it's got strong bass and a strong mid-treble. The famous name is Sennheiser HD800. Pretty good extension for an open dynamic headphone, actually. This is pretty good. Does have the rise, doesn't have the rise in this area, and then has a pretty good fall off afterwards, but probably not quite enough. Should fall off in this area a little bit more than it does, which makes this headphone a little bit bright as well. Okay, here's the NAD Viso HP50, and of the headphones that I've measured, this one is probably second closest to the Harman response curve of any I've measured. It does have a bass boost. It's done by 300 as opposed to being done by 200, so it can sound a little thick in there. It has a rise here, not much, but it's got one, and then a steeper rise up to the top, and then a good, again, it's noisy, which is normal, but has a fairly good shape to it right here. This is a very, very good sounding headphone. Yeah?
Tyll, how does this compare to the PSB? It's pretty similar, right?
The PSB is pretty similar. The problem that I had with the PSB is in the time domain, and it's got some pretty sharp spikes in the time, pretty sharp ringing kind of stuff in the leading edge. It's pretty aggressive on the leading edge, but frequency response is quite similar. Focal Spirit Pro, it's close. It's got a bass boost here. It doesn't have quite the right shape going over to here, and it has this big notch right here. Now, this big notch is kind of an interesting thing. Philips, when they went from their X1 to their X2, intentionally put a notch in this 6 to 8K region because they felt their subjective listening test showed that people thought it could be too strident if it didn't have that in there. So this is something to watch out for in the future, people having a little notch between 6 and 8K. That seems like they're trying to do it sometimes. I don't know that that's the case with Focal. I don't think it was actually, but there you go. This is, I think, and boy, Sean, if you guys come up with something, if you see this is not kosher, please let me know, but I think what happens is, when you see this shape where you have a bump and a bump and a bump like that, and a bump there and a bump there and a bump there, and it's hard to see these bumps clearly, you end up with this this ringing in the front end of the signal, rings 3 times and decreases. That shape appears quite often. The Skullcandy Aviators have it. Quite a number of headphones have this shape, and it tends to be not damaging. It tends to make the headphone not quite sound precise and articulate as if it had a very clean leading edge, but it tends also not to be damaging. It's one of those things where it still sounds good, you know. It's just not quite as resolving as it could be otherwise. But I think it comes from ear canal resonances. I'm not sure though. That's just my guess. Here's an in-ear headphone. This is one that's actually pretty close for an in-ear headphone. In-ear headphones will always have a lot of these peaky things. They come from the resonances of the tubes and stuff that connect the drivers to the ear and the ear canal resonances itself. One of the things that's interesting about these headphones, maybe will show up later in the slideshow, is that they put the primary resonance of the driver at 2.7K, which is right where that gain bump should be. So they use the resonance of the driver in in-ear headphones to make the hump. So that hump at 3K is done. That hump right there is mostly done by the fact that that's where the driver resonance is in that headphone. A lot of in-ear headphones have way too much bass. Just huge amounts. This bass is 5, 10, 15 dB up in the lows, and you just see it over and over and over again. It's just too much. There's a Barrow Wilkins C5. Good shape up here. Really good shape, but holy smoke, who needs that much bass? On the other hand, Automotive, these guys are real good technically, and they have a pretty fine shape on the top end of this thing for a single driver balanced armature, but there's no bass boost, and they like it that way. I wish they didn't, because they do things so well. So here's some other things we see on headphones. This is pad bounce. So this is the headphones literally going like this when there's a resonant frequency that the pads bounce on the head, and so at some frequencies, you're going to get this bouncing of the pad, and that can be seen in the measurements. So these are 3 different headphones. This is the biodynamic DT48, which is the world's record holder for longest in production headphone. It started in production in, I don't know, the 40s or maybe even earlier than that. Anyway, it's got bad pad bounce, but a lot of headphones you'll see it. It tends to not be a problem. You tend not to hear it because usually you don't have that much energy just sitting in that one space that you can hear it. But what's interesting is these are the isolation plots. So this is a plot that shows you how much sound is removed by the headphone from the outside world, how well it's isolating you. And you'll notice that at the frequency of the pad bounce, it actually rises before it starts attenuating. So there's a moment where there's actually gain, where it's louder inside the headphones than it is outside the headphones for the sound out there, because it's resonating with the pad bounce. So that's if you see those features, the bump on the isolation and the wiggle over here, that's the pads bouncing on your ears. Pad sealing quality, you can, when a pad seals, it will be able to get better bass and better pressurization in between the driver and your ear. And this headphone, you could see that it was having a hard time sealing as I moved it around. It would move up and down, and a lot of the frequency response was moving up and down. This is an odd one. It does have more than I've experienced most headphones. This is a Master and Dynamic MH40, and it's got a really powerful seal on it. You can tell when it's not sealed even when you're wearing it, and that's kind of unusual. Here's another on-ear headphone, and you can see that it's really all over the map in its frequency response. I try very hard to make sure that I get as good a measurement in every position as I can. I do try to make it right in every position. But some headphones just move around, and there's not much you can do about it, and at that point it would be lying to not show, to try too hard to make it look good at every position. And that's why if you see a curve like this one, where there's one flyer coming down like that, I probably did that intentionally. I had a hard time with this headphone. I probably saw this bass drop off happen a lot, but I could usually fix it. But on one of the measurements, I intentionally let it go off because it was doing it a lot, and that was representative of that headphone. So this is where the craft of it comes in. Sometimes it's just, there's a bit of art to this. There is some things that I can do to make the measurements look certain ways, and I oftentimes will always listen to a headphone before I measure it, and then when I measure it, if it doesn't, sometimes I can see that it's not measuring the way I heard it, and then I will work harder to sort of make sure those 2 points are aligned, where that's pretty much what it's sounding like. This is an example of a headphone that is kind of one way or the other. It either seals or it doesn't seal, and there's no halfway in between. And a lot of times on these headphones, I don't know if I did it with this one or not, but a lot of times with those headphones, I'll put a little piece of felt between the ear cup in the side of the head to mimic hair, because hair will mitigate this problem a little bit. So sometimes I put a little bit of felt there when it does something like this, because it's obviously either sealing too well or not well enough. All right, now this is another one of those weird things. A comb filter is when you take a signal and you delay it and then feed it back onto itself. So if you take a signal and delay it 1 millisecond and feed it back on itself, you'll get a cancellation at 500 hertz, I think. But at any rate, it's because the signal cancels in and out with itself and creates a comb filter. And some headphones are designed so that sound from the back of the driver can get around through the baffle plate and into the chamber. Ultrasones are famous for this. They take some of the energy and they bring it around to the front of the driver plate. And it can create comb filter effects. And these are almost always just horrible sounding. So this is a biodynamic T1, and what you're looking for here are these kind of humped features. You can see it best in this one below, where it's these humps that look kind of like that in the frequency response. Right in there, you can see a couple of them. You can see this right here. There's a hump feature right there, and really clear on this one. And what it does is it makes these really spiky leading edges of square wave, and it just sounds terrible. So that's one to watch out for. Earbuds suck. This is a Sennheiser MX560. As a class, these are not the ones that seal in your ear canal. These are the ones that rest in the concha of your ridge, concha ridge of your ear, your typical iPod earbud, the white thing. They cannot do any bass because they don't seal in the ear canal, so you get really weak bass response. And this is actually a pretty good sounding earbud for an earbud. You can see it's got fairly good shape up here, fairly good, but down here it's just horrible. Kids want bass, and so they try to turn these up to get the bass to go up, and of course what they're doing is just turning up this big treble thing and damaging their ears. So earbuds lack of bass is probably the leading cause of hearing damage 25 years from now. Yeah, so buying stock in hearing aid companies is probably a pretty good idea at this point. So this is the old Apple earbud, and this is the new Apple EarPod. And you can see that it's got a whole octave more bass here. This starts at 200 hertz rolling off, and this starts at 100 hertz rolling off, because it can focus the sound better into the ear canal. They did a pretty good job with that, actually. It's a pretty good sounding earbud. Best sounding earbud I've heard is the UNPK1, mostly because it doesn't have any strong treble peak in it. So when you turn it up a little bit, it doesn't sound too bad. Here's some really bad measurements. This is the Howard Light Sync. It's a headphone that's also a high noise isolation headphone. It's for loud environments, listening in loud environments. Really, really, really bright sounding, horribly bright, no bass. The current Cost Pro 4AA, first headphone I ever owned was 4AA back in the day. I just recently got to measure a vintage Pro 4AA, and it measures way better than that. But anyway, no bass, no treble, something in between, squawk, squawk. This is a Flare Audio R1. This is a brand new headphone from England that's being touted as awesome by the engineer from Metallica or somebody, I can't remember who, but it's an English company that makes some recording equipment, and they thought they had a really good idea with this vortex processor, I don't know what they call it, vortex something technology behind the driver. It has this kind of weird pattern, a very strong but unusual looking pattern of channels behind the driver. And of course, as soon as you have something that's a pattern, it's going to have a resonance. You know, what you don't want in acoustics is a nice regular pattern. What you do want is randomization. So anyway, they got their pattern in their frequency response.
Why do you suppose they put a notch in that frequency?
Well, I don't think they intended to. They just ended up with one. They had what they thought was a really good idea, and then they just implemented it. Well, it wasn't a good idea.
Probably never measured it.
No, they probably didn't measure it. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at square wave response instead of frequency response. And congratulations, this is the second time I've done this talk. It's still not very good yet, but at the first time I did it, it was the end of the show is right here because I ran out of time. So I took away a lot of frequency response measurements. All right, the second thing we're going to do is a square wave response, and the square wave response lets us look at the performance of the headphones in the time domain instead of the frequency domain. You can calculate one from the other, but now, a lot of times you'll hear about square waves. What is a square wave? Oh, it's the sum of all the odd harmonics at a certain, in the right ratio, in the right time alignment. And this is true. And so if you take a signal and all its odd harmonics and at the right levels and in the right phase relationship and you add them together, you get something like that. And this is like 5 different frequencies. And if you put 20 together, you'll get a much cleaner square wave. If you change the phase relationship, if you advance the phase, you get little peaks, little things like that at the beginning of the square wave. If you change the ratio, so this one has more high frequency information than it should, it'll start looking like this. If you change the ratio so there's less high frequency information than it should be, it'll look something like that. Well, the problem is a square wave is not, yeah, you can break it down and say it's all the odd frequencies, but it's really not. It's just a level and then changing to another level and then changing back to this level. And for me, the reason why I use square wave is that it does give you a picture of it in time, but it also gives you some idea of the frequency response. You can tell the balance of the frequency response because of the shape. Just like I showed over here, that you can tell that this has not enough high frequencies in it, and then this one has too much high frequencies in it. So the point is you can tell about the frequency response by looking at the square wave response as well as the time domain stuff. So anyway, the way I look at a square wave is that when it initially goes up, you're looking at the bandwidth limit of the system. So that rise time is going to tell you your high frequency limit. And then as the time goes on, what you're really looking at is how well it's retaining that height at various frequencies. And so you can tell a little bit of, it's not just the odd harmonics. You're not learning about just the odd harmonics. You can actually, there's a continuum of frequencies that you can tell about. Not just a lot of people get confused on that because they heard about this odd harmonic thing. This one you're going to have to go to the website. On the website, on the resources tab, there's the thing called Headphone Measurements Explained, and then you can drill into it and get to the various articles. This is too small to see, but this shows you, this chart shows you, depending on the shape of the square waves, what the nature of the problems are that are going on. And I'm going to have to redo it because I did this about 2 years ago and I've learned a lot since then, so I'm going to have to go back and redo it one of these days. All right, so now we're going to take a quick look at some headphones and their square wave response. This is the Sennheiser HD800. The top plot is the 30 hertz square wave, and the bottom one is a 300 hertz square wave. So this one's much higher frequency than that one. And you can see the Sennheiser HD800, if you remember from earlier on, the Sennheiser HD800 plot had a long, sort of gently rolling off bass, and that's what this is. You see right here, this sway back here is not being able to keep the bass high for long periods of time. So what this plot will show us is how good the bass response is, and then also some stuff about the phase of the bass response. If that tail goes below 0, in other words, this line goes much farther down, then it's got bass energy, it's just not in phase anymore. So usually that's a headphone that'll sound a little bit mushy, but still have enough bass. So the height is not an absolute telling you how much bass there is, because it can go out of phase. Again, you're adding in the time domain part of this thing as well. And if you look at the 300 hertz response, you can see this initial spike is higher than the rest of the waveform. That's okay. It probably should do that. How do I know that? I've seen a lot of these measurements and listened to them a lot, and they need a little bit of a blip on the front here to sound right. And remember that the frequency response isn't flat at the eardrum, so the square wave response isn't going to be flat at the eardrum either, and it's going to make things that look like this, and it turn out to be probably okay because it's not flat. Okay, so this is Sony MDR-V600. I'm just going to kind of go through these real quick. See how the bass undershoots right here? So this one's going out of phase a little bit at the low frequencies, so you can expect this headphone to have poor low frequency response because it's going down a lot, but also to be going out of phase, it's going to sound a little woolly and funky. Also, no overshoot at the front end. This headphone's going to sound a little rolled off. It's not going to sound responsive. Holy smoky. How come I missed so many of those? There we go. Here's the Odyssey LCD 2. Look at this beautiful flat bass response here. This is a great headphone in terms of bass response. Very, very good. But if we look at the little leading edge blip closely, because this up here is just this, this is a blow up of this, really. It's got two little blips at the leading edge of the waveform. That generally, happens on planar magnetic headphones. You see it on a lot of them, two blips on the leading edge. And it tends to, I think, hurt imaging, because imaging, your brain builds an image by comparing the arrival times of edges and transients. And if you've got double blips on the leading edge of edges, it's not going to know where to cue as well. And as a consequence, your imaging gets a little bit destroyed. And if you look at the Sennheiser HD800, which is a headphone that has incredible imaging, it's got very, very precise leading edge blip with nothing afterwards. Boy, one of these days, somebody's going to do it. Grado PS1000, this is a very typical Grado plot. They all look pretty much the same. They all sound pretty much the same. No bass. The fact that it shoots below the line means it's going out of phase, and it's got this just horrible amount of noise and crap on the leading edge of the signal. So this is not a good measurement, and I don't like Grado headphones, and that's why, right? You can see it right there. They're just not precise. Okay, now let's see how far we are here. Okay, T.H.E plus noise. This is another measurement. This is a harmonic distortion measurement. It's about the linearity of a device. Remember back in the day, in the 80s and 70s, late 70s, we started seeing the word linear amplifiers everywhere. That was a big word for a while. Oh, it's a linear amplifier. Ooh, know. So linear means that you get out what you're putting in. And that's what distortion is, when you get things out that you're not putting in. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about distortion and the transfer function. How we measure distortion is you put in a probe tone at 60, 70 hertz and move it up so it's woo. You put in a probe tone, and then you put in a filter on the receiving end and filter out the probe tone, and then you just measure how much energy is left. So it's a measurement of anything other than the tone that you're putting in there. And so what you're going to get out is all the harmonics, the contribution from all the harmonics of that tone. So if you put in a 1 kilohertz tone, you'll get out a little bit of 2 kilohertz and 3 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, and you'll be able to measure those because that's not where the notch filter is. So you're measuring those harmonic results, but you're also measuring noise. Okay, you're measuring anything in the system. Okay, let's see here. So this is the transfer function. We're going to talk about linear. By linear, I mean this is the transfer function line. You put in a signal down here, it wiggles back and forth up and down this line, and you get a signal out like that. So if you have a straight line in this transfer curve, you're going to get the same shape signal out as what you put in, and it'll just be one frequency component, the frequency component of what went in. This is linear. This line, the transfer function of the device is what they mean by linear. So now, if you turn up the volume, all you're really doing is making this line change, and you can see that the output is bigger than the input before, but you still only have the one harmonic. Likewise, you can change the gain curve of this transfer function and get an output that's smaller. But you can also change the shape of this transfer curve. And in this case, what I did was essentially is the shape of an amplifier, and that's the power supply limit. So it has all this as linear until it hits the power supply rails at the plus and minus side. And then if you put a signal in that's bigger than this curve, the linear part of this curve, you'll end up clipping the top and bottom of the curve as it hits that limit, and that's going to produce odd harmonics. So you'll see the odd harmonics pop up here. So this is the transfer function's linear, except it only goes so far and it'll start to clip. All right, so in tube amplifiers, or they have a softer clip, and this now you're seeing an amplifier that you get up towards the end and it can't go any farther. And this happens in headphones too, by the way, because a diaphragm can only go so far before it hits the limit of how far you can push it out, either because it's gone past, the coil has come out of the magnet, or because the diaphragm is just stretched to its limit. So you can have limitations in headphones like this too. So this soft clipping will result in a kind of a rounded off, but still flattened on the top, unlike that curve right there, and you'll get odd harmonics. They just won't be as big as when you hard clip. Then tube amplifiers, single-ended tube amplifiers, have a gain curve that's got curves only in one direction. It's not S-shaped, and it tends to makes the signal elongated on one side and shortened on the other side, and it produces even harmonic distortion. So when the gain curve is curved like that, it'll produce even order distortion. And then you can have a mix of both, where there's a strong curve this way, but it's S-curved as well, and you'll get a whole series of even and odd harmonics up here. The one thing to be aware of is that ideally, I can't remember the name of the guy that did this, but ideally there is this nice, every harmonic is subsequently reducing and going down in a shape like that. That's what you'd like to see. Okay, so the result of one of these curves is that we get something like this. This is a very good total harmonic distortion plus noise curve. Basically, it's just showing you that there's this much. This is probably mostly noise limited, so there's not very much harmonic distortion here. And I do this measurement at two levels. I do it at 90 dB and at 100 dB. Okay, so that's both of them are pretty loud. And what happens is, at the 100 dB level, the noise, it's 10 dB higher above the noise floor, okay? So when you raise the level like that, you're going to reduce the T.H.E plus noise, because you're now 10 dB higher over the noise. So when I do this at 100 dB, the 100 dB curve should be underneath the 90 dB curve.
Spikes it. Is this the system that switches it?
Yeah, yes, exactly. The spikes at 200 hertz and 2K is from the gears, range switching. Okay, here's two headphones that look very similar but have very different responses. And you can see that this headphone is having problems in bass distortion. So there's a couple, three things that really you can only see that you get from these T.H.E curves. And one of them is how much bass distortion you're getting. And there's a lot of problems with bass distortions on headphones. Probably half of headphones have some kind of an elevated bass distortion level. It comes either from the driver not being able to maintain the high pressure in the ear cup for a long period of time. So at very low frequencies, it's got to keep that pressure high for a long period of time, and it just doesn't have the excursion or the surface area to do that. And that's why sealed headphones can keep deliver more bass than open headphones, is because they have that chamber to pressurize that's sealed. At any rate, so if it's not keeping the chamber pressurized, you're going to get distortion because it'll clip. And then also, if the driver is exceeding its ability to drive anymore, it's just hitting the elastic limits of the driver or leaving the voice coil. I'm not sure how to tell which is which. I have kind of a guess, but at any rate, this headphone has got a lot of bass distortion, and this one doesn't. And they're made by the same company, and they look very much the same, but they just don't sound the same. Okay, here's a Fostex T50RP. This is an old sealed headphone, but you can see we've got some rising bass distortion, and that's pretty, as I say, fairly common in headphones. Oh, this time it's not curved. That one, see how it goes up and then it levels out, and this one just goes up and keeps going up. I think do you know anything about this, Sean? Do you know anything about this curve thing?
No, I don't know this headphone.
Okay. I'm not sure, but I think one of them's from not being able to maintain the pressure in front of the driver, and the other one is the driver reaching some sort of limit, but I'm not really sure.
It has to do with the primary resonance of the driver.
No, because then you'd only see it at one frequency. Well, the rise starts below the primary resonance of the driver typically, except that this is a planar magnetic, and it won't have the primary driver resonance won't be there. It'll be higher in frequency, I would think, but in fact, it's probably in here. At any rate, T50RP planar magnetic headphones, a lot of times you'll see problems right in the mid-range, actually, in terms of distortion. So this one, and what we're looking at on the T.H.E plus noise thing is gross artifacts, and you can see that this is a sort of a general trend of an artifact. If you see something that's a little small blip, like one of these blips up here or something like that, I would tend to not worry about it. I don't know what they are. I don't know where they came from. It could be a car driving down my street, okay, because I only have so much isolation in my little chamber, and it's measuring noise. And anytime a truck or a car goes down the street, that's probably enough noise for this system to measure, because this is a very sensitive system. So you may see little tiny features. I would not worry about them. Not that they're mostly from that, but just that there's not much you can do with the information, generally speaking. So here's an Oppo PM1. This is a brand new, this is a headphone that's been around for ages and ages and ages, but they're both planar magnetic headphones. Notice the distortion here, and then notice on the Oppo PM1 it has a distortion in the same area. That is from the manufacturer. They told me that that's where the driver's resonance is, and on the impedance plot you can see the resonances right here. So these are the two primary driver resonances, and you can see a relationship relationship between that and the T.H.E plus noise plot. Yeah.
Are all these distortion square wave measurements on the head torso simulator?
Sorry, what?
Are these measurements done at the drum reference?
Are they? I'm sorry, I didn't quite.
Are all of these measurements done at the drum reference point?
Oh, yes, right. All the measurements are done taken by the eardrum of the head. So we're just going to flick through a couple of these. Skullcandy Grind. It's got, as you can see, we've got a rise in the bass, but here we see these big blips right here, and we can see some, like in the impedance plots, some blips over here. These are that's probably the driver going into modal breakup at some frequencies. It also could be problems in the acoustics right around the driver. But what you want to do is look at the impedance and the T.H.E together, and you can see things, a relationship between them a lot of times. Here's some really bad measurements. These are both $1,000 plus headphones. This is the AKG K812, and this is I think it's the Beyer T5. But again, you can see a big rise in distortion in the mids here, and you can see this really discontinuous looking impedance and electrical phase plot. Similarly, on this impedance, you can see a big rise, or T.H.E, you can see a big rise in T.H.E here, and at the same time, some blips up there. In that frequency response range, again, what we're talking about is problems with driver resonances and things like that. Okay, I think I've hit the wall here of how much I can get out in one shot. Oh, which was cool. We did get to the end of the slides. Any questions?
Has little to do with measurements, but form factor. I can't use earbuds. One ear seems to be misshapen compared to the other. Constantly. I was curious, is this a common problem? Have you seen this a lot?
No, people's ear canals are quite different from ear to ear, and in fact, when they take measurements of human ears at the eardrum, they very often find differences in the frequency response of your left and right ear as much as 5 dB and maybe more at times, but your brain figures it out. This ear canal on me has a much harder corner on it than this ear, so I have a similar thing. So it's common, and it just makes it hard. Not much you can do about it. Yeah. Here's the good news: your brain is going to figure it all out for you. You can still listen just as good as anybody.
When you show the frequency response, and you might have mentioned this, you have the compensated curve at the top.
Yep.
What is the correction curve that you use?
I use the independent of direction curve. I'm working on building an automated tool, getting it financed somehow, so that you can on the website there will be a tool where you can pick a headphone and another headphone and then compare them directly one against each other. And when that tool becomes available, I'm going to switch. It's going to have the ability to you choose which compensation curve you'll use. So you'll be able to look at the independent direction, diffuse field, hopefully a Harman curve, maybe one that I come up with.
So let's thank Tyll.
All right.
And we'll set up for the next speaker. I'm sure
Thank you.
Tyll will be willing to take some questions later on the way out, and also outside perhaps.